Okay, world history students, I know these lectures are your favorite, and here's another one on the Persian Wars, um, dating first to 490 BC. And so go ahead and have your outline ready, and you'll be taking notes on three separate sections, basically three segments of this war, famous conflict of East meets West. Let's dive right in. Okay, so here we have this just a summary of the three parts of this lecture and the kind of the way that I'm organizing the war. The first is going to be on the Ionian Revolt, talk about what that is. Then there was a first invasion that involves the Battle of Marathon, and then a second invasion that involves the battles of Thermopylae and Salamis primarily. Okay, and so just before I get to the next slide, what we're talking about are really called the Greco-Persian Wars, and that is a series of wars over about the span of a decade between Greece, the small city-states of Greece, very much a small and not an empire of any kind, just the polises that we've been talking about, Athens and Sparta and Thebes and Delphi and all these other places, against, up to that time, the most massive empire in world history, the Persian Empire. Whatever it is, I think the bronze waist of Nebuchadnezzar's dream. And we're going to look at a map today to just show you the size difference. But it's basically a battle of this massive Eastern Empire against this fledgling Greek city state with basically the fate of Western civilization in the balance. And so that's why we need to dive in. Already given you a little bit of the so what. So let's start with first the Ionian Revolt. And so the Ionian Revolt, this is part one, refers to the eastern part of Asia Minor. If you look off here to the right of the map, that you see the Persian Empire. That is Turkey, also known as Asia Minor. Kind of sticks out from the rest of Asia towards Greece and Europe. And that is a region that the Greeks began to cross the Aegean Sea. Greece is there in blue on the left. Cross to the right over to and they had various settlements. But what happened is those Greek settlements on the eastern Aegean in Ionia slash Asia Minor slash Turkey, all names for the same thing, they came under the control of the Persian Empire. That's why they're there in the orange. And so, although they were Greek peoples and they were Greek colonies, they became under the taxation and the rule of the Persians. And so, this created a source of conflict because had to pay tribute to the Persian Empire. And Greeks, being Greeks, very independent minded, very much into their having their own form of government for their own city state, didn't appreciate that much. It's going to lead to a revolt. And so what happens shortly before 490 BC, these Greek colonies on Asia Minor send out requests from aid from mainland Greeks. So in other words, the colonies in the orange here start asking the blue colonies for help. Hey, send us troops. We're tired of being under the thumb and paying tribute to this Persian Empire. The Spartans, being the most militarily famous city state, again, they're completely militarized in their organization. They refuse. They think, we're not crossing the Aegean Sea and get involved in somebody else's fight. They say no. So the guy goes to Athens, and the Athenians go, yeah, sounds like a good idea. Let's go do it. Sounds like an adventure. Sounds like a chance to grow richer. Maybe we'll gain influence. And so the Athenians go, and they support some of these city states as they try to revolt against Persia. They burn this city named Sardis, and basically earn the wrath of the Persian Empire. The revolt itself fails. They burn down the city and wreak a little bit of havoc, but then Persia sends in its mighty forces and crushes the revolt. And the main results of this revolt are that the Persia says, wait a minute, who are these Greeks daring to cross the ocean and mess with our colonies? Now, the Greeks see them as Greek colonies that they're allied with, not like they're the same country, but they're the same people. They speak the same language. They have the same heritage. But Darius, the current king of Persia, becomes angered at the Greek colonies, especially Athens, saying, we're going to have to do something about these Greeks if they think they can just sail over and start burning down our cities and fomenting revolt among our subjects. Famously, Darius ordered one of his servants to, whenever at every meal, to always tell him, remember the Athenians. Before he ate, remember the Athenians, so that it kept him on his mind that he owed some vengeance to the Athenians and the rest of the Greece for daring to uh, attack his empire there in Ionia. And so then that takes us to the first serious engagement, and the first serious invasion, which will culminate in the Battle of Marathon, which is where we get our date 490 BC. Darius decides that he is going to, in fact, invade not just Ionia, where he already has control of the Greek colonies, but he wants to invade Greece proper. and he's particularly, as I said, going after Athens itself. So he hops. Let's see, we're going to get a map here in a second. Maybe I'll go back to this map. So he begins hopping across the islands on his way to Athens, and you can actually see the darker brown or purple line. That is his route that they take to then invade and attack Athens via a naval landing. So it's a beach landing. And the beach that they arrive to is right on that is, I think something like 25 miles or so from, or 20 miles or so from Athens, a beach called Marathon. And that's where the king of Persia, Darius, tries to land his troops so that he can begin to march out and sack Athens in revenge for their fomenting of the Ionian revolt. The way the two forces measure up is the Persians first. They number 25,000 strong. They have a number of cavalry, which are horse-mounted troops, and also archers, which they're lightly armored, but they can strike at a long distance. They're kind of like the artillery of the day because they can launch over a long distance. The Greeks, who are the Athenians, they have heard that Darius is coming, that he is invading, and so they marched out of Athens and they decide to take their stand there on the beach of Marathon. The name of the Greek troops at the time were known as hoplites. Hoplites were armored foot soldiers who had helmets and shields and greaves along their shins and also along their arms, and they primarily fought with a long, very, very long spear that we'll look at a picture at in a minute. And they did have a short sword that they could pull out if once their spear was broken and if they became engaged in one-on-one combat. The Athenian numbers were less than half of the Persian number at 10,000 strong at Marathon. Just a depiction where you have the Greek soldier on the right. Notice the feathered crest, the helmet, the large metal or bronze shield. You can see the greaves on his leg. At this point, the spear has been dropped. They're fighting with a dagger. The Persian troops were much less heavily armored. They had leather and even just cloth armor. Their shields were not metal, but kind of a toughened leather. They didn't have metal helmets, and so they were much more numerous, but they were also less well armed and less well protected. This is how the Greeks fought. And you can see now the spears that I mentioned. Greek fighting was not typically, even why this picture is a little misleading, one-on-one, but they fought as a unit. They fought as in what was called a phalanx, in which they would line up shoulder to shoulder, where their shield would cover the man next to them, and then they carried a spear 2 to 3 times longer than a man, so that it extended well beyond the striking distance of the enemy. And then they would march almost like again, almost like an armored tank. They called them the armored porcupine, because then they would march towards the enemy and then thrust, and then so the enemy couldn't even engage them while they began to basically plow through them with a kind of like a forest of spears. And the guys in the back, you can see they would keep their spears raised until they were needed, but you lend their weight towards pushing this mass of men forward, and it was just kind of meant to steamroll over and skewer the enemy. And so it was definitely a group fighting tactic. So here's just other depictions. You can kind of appreciation of what that would look like trying to march into a phalanx of Greek hoplite soldiers with their spears extended. They'd have their commander standing off to the right to kind of maintain order. Your shield was usually meant to protect the man next to you. So this one picture is a little off, but that encouraged unity and closeness. I think it was roughly the first 3 or 4 ranks that they would have their spears extended. And again, as long as they maintained a single fighting unit, the Greek phalanx was very formidable. Long story short, the vastly outnumbered Greek force pulls off what many historians consider a miraculous victory at the Battle of Marathon. The Persian forces are defeated, and in terms of how that happened, basically the Greeks decided to do something that had never happened in battle against the Persians by any other force, and they charged the Persian force. They charged at them in order to get not out of range, but within range of their, not even within range, but to get through the range of their archers as quickly as possible and to engage at close quarters. Because once you close in close quarters with the enemy, then all of a sudden arrows were no longer useful because you could be hitting your men as well as the enemy. And so what happened is they pressed forward and they closed the distance between the Persian force. They caught them kind of unawares. The Persian force had just recently all gotten off of their landing ships at the beach. and then kind of thought, the Greeks might run away, or they might wait to fight on a different ground. But instead, the Greeks charged down, I think over a mile at the time, to engage them in close combat with their phalanxes. The middle of the Greek formation gave way, and so the Persians pushed up through the middle, thinking, hey, we've got them on the run. But just as they did that, the two stronger forces at the side came in and collapsed around the Persian force, surrounding them, and inflicting heavy, heavy casualties. The number of Persians killed were in the hundreds, and maybe even upwards of thousands, whereas the Greek casualties were very, very minimal. It was a massive Greek victory, despite being outnumbered heavily. Athens, as a result, they had basically, with a little bit of help from another city-state, had single-handedly defeated this first Persian invasion. They were heralded as the saviors of Greece. Darius vows to return to exact his revengeance. He evacuates, or he retreats. And for 3 years, he prepares an even larger fighting force to invade and once and for all humble the city of Athens. However, he dies in the process, and it's his son Xerxes, famously depicted in the movie 300, who not accurately, I would say. I don't think he actually looked like that. That's the comic book version of him. But Xerxes, his son, takes the throne, but vows to finish what his father started. He said his father was shamed and embarrassed at the defeat of Marathon, but he's going to remember Athens and crush all of Greece in the name of Persia. So that takes us to our last point, the second invasion and the battles of Thermopylae and Salamis. This time it is a double invasion. Xerxes takes a different invasion route than his father Darius, and he invades by both land and sea. And we'll go ahead and look at a map in a second. And his goal is not just the embarrassment and the humbling of Athens. He wants to invade and occupy Greece and eventually march into all of Europe. And so the freedoms of the Greek city-states and the future of Europe hang in the balance with this conflict, which is why, of all world history battles that we could be discussing, these Persian wars were very important to the survival and then the eventual spread of Western civilization. Let's see if we can get a better map. Maybe we don't have one. Okay. In order to get to Athens, they have to cross this narrow strait known as the Hellespont. Sorry, my picture's blocking the words there. The Hellespont, and Xerxes famously builds a massive bridge across it's not a river, it's basically a bay kind of, and they build it by lashing all these ships together and then building a path across it. And so his army, according to the Greek historian, was 250,000 strong. That could very likely be an overestimate, but we do know it was larger than his father's invasion, and absolutely terrifying to all of those who saw it coming. Many of the Greek city-states, when they showed up, basically capitulated and said, all right, we swear allegiance to the Persians, and many of them ended up even fighting on the side of the Persians, because when they saw the size of Xerxes' invading force, it was overwhelming. Oops. Here. Oops. Click here. Okay. The first battle that takes place during this invasion, after they cross that Hellespont, is the Battle of Thermopylae. And so in order to get down into the Greek peninsula, there's this narrow road that goes between the oceans and the mountains. And that was a place of hot springs called Thermopylae, or the kind of the hot place. The Spartans this time, who don't help out at Marathon, decide to send up an advance force to stop them. They basically know it's a suicide mission because, again, the force is Persia's force is in the tens of thousands. The Spartans simply send 300 men. They also have about 1,000, I think, Thessalons. So it's about a force of about 1,300 against tens of thousands. But the idea is they go to this place called Thermopylae because it's a very narrow roadway. It's a bottleneck. And so Xerxes can only bring so many of his men to attack at once because they're squeezed between the mountains and the ocean. We'll see a picture in a second. And so for 3 days, the Spartans, led by King Leonidas, hold out. And they're able to delay the attack of the Persians. That picture here is the Spartans forming a line and the Persian horde coming through that mountain pass. Eventually, a Spartan defector named Epiotes betrays them and shows the Persian army a secret way through the mountains and how to get behind the Spartan line. And they're able to surround the Spartan force and annihilate them. If he had, without betrayal, they might have been able to hold out almost indefinitely because of the skill of the Spartan warriors and the fact that Xerxes could not bring his entire army to attack because of the bottleneck. But despite the death of the 300 Spartans and their 1,000 Thessalians, they do buy enough time for the other Greek forces to mobilize, and also they end up evacuating Athens because after the defeat of the Spartans at Thermopylae, or the sacrifice, um, uh, Xerxes marches into Athens and burns the city. So this time he's able to fulfill what his father failed to do. Just keep clicking on that. Here's kind of a map, but I'll just show you can see Thermopylae circled right there, and how it's right along the ocean. And so Xerxes was marching. The land arrow is what he was marching with his land force, but then he also had parallel to the coast was sending his navy, and so that's why it was both a land and a sea invasion. They reach Athens there at the bottom, and they do destroy Athens, but then that encounter sets up. Well, we'll get to that in a second. Okay, so the 300 Spartans at Thermopylae have been memorialized all throughout classical and early history for their sacrificial stand in saving Greece. They do lose, but they die immortal heroes. Little background on Sparta. Why were they so feared? Why were they the first choice for battle? Well, they were a totalitarian society. Sparta, as a city state, had chosen to be ruled by an oligarchy of kings who were basically generals, and they and the military basically controlled all of civil life in Sparta. Boys were trained from the age of 7. They were taken from their families and trained up to be soldiers for the state. They lived in separate barracks. Even the married men doesn't mean they married men. It means even if you were married, you didn't live with your wife. Your wife stayed home. She managed the books. She engaged in commerce. She ran the fields. Spartan women actually ended up doing a lot because the men were not around. They were isolated off training as soldiers for the defense of the state. Highly, highly militarized. And I think in spite of their reputation, many today would see it as extremely oppressive. As I noted there, women would have a large degree of freedom in trade, business, and land ownership because the men were off fighting. And also, it was a highly slave labor intensive society because, again, all men were mobilized in the military. And so the slaves known as helots were the ones who did most of the work in the farming in Sparta. Another depiction of the Battle of Thermopylae. Again, this is a good one that shows a little bit of the bottleneck between the mountains and the sea that allowed just 300 men to hold off tens of thousands for 3 days until they were betrayed. They have a memorial to the Spartans to this day. The coastal line has since changed, so there's a picture of it today. Where there once was water, there's now a freeway. How beautiful. All right, and so then that takes us to the second major engagement of this second invasion, and that is a naval battle known as Salamis. So as it notes there at the top, Xerxes sacks and burns Athens, but he hasn't defeated the Greek military because they were able to, thanks to the sacrifice of the Spartans, to evacuate from Athens to a little island known as Salamis. Okay, and so Xerxes says, "I need to send in now my navy to bring a decisive defeat of the Greek navy." Greece called their navy their wooden wall. They said, we didn't have any land walls to defeat the Persian Empire, but we're going to use our navy to defeat them at sea and protect our families and all our evacuees or refugees on the island of Salamis. And what they did, we're not going to get into much of the strategy, but what they do is they basically trick the Persians into believing that they're giving up, that because Athens has been burned and because the Spartans have died, they have no more will to resist. And so they draw the Persian fleet into a very narrow strait of water, thinking that they're all going to defect or they've all given up and they don't want to fight. And so when the Persians show up thinking they're going to meet little resistance, instead, the massive united Greek navy rides out and catches them again, kind of like in the narrow straits of Thermopylae, in the narrow waters out around Salamis, and they are able to decisively defeat them. This type of naval battle was fought by ships known as triremes. They're called triremes because you had 3 levels of oars. We'll look at another picture in a minute that propelled them. That's how the ships could sail, but that was only an open sea. When they went into battle, they would have oarsmen, hundreds of oarsmen below decks, 3 levels of them, trireme, and they would have a big, heavy bronze or metal bow, and they would ram that bow into the sides of other ships, causing them to sink. You can also see they have planks along the tops of the decks, and they would actually have armed hoplites, armed soldiers on top of there, so that they could even run almost like pirate style, run onto the other ship, and if possible, either kill the crew and kill the defenders, or maybe even take the ship and make it their own, depending on how damaged it was. And so it was kind of a mix of land combat along with, again, ramming speed that this battle was taking place. And so you can see why when we talk about they were luring the Persians into kind of a narrow space, that the space was crucial, because that didn't matter, again, how much bigger the Persian fleet was, but it also, again, made the ability to bring about this physical conflict or physical ramming more easily. The one on the right is a modern day construction of a ancient Greek trireme. Those little models. Again, you can see the 3 levels on the right, and again, very clearly see the deck of the model on the left, as well as the face or the bow or of the ship that was the primary weapon of a trireme, used to ram the enemy. You paint faces and ghoulish things on the front in order to intimidate their enemies. They wouldn't have the sails up during combat. That would be if they were sailing the open waters. Battle of Salamis. Again, Salamis was an island to which the Athenians fled after their city was under attack. But just what I want to emphasize is the narrowness. That, again, as the Persians rushed in thinking the Greeks were defeated, they were able to catch them a little bit by surprise, or surprised by the fact that they were still willing to fight, and drive all the Greek ships onto the beach and destroy them. Not all of them, but very decisively most of them. Okay, just another rendition of the close combat of the. Also, the Greeks were also, it said at least, were better swimmers than many of the Persians, and so when the ship went down, Greeks were much more likely to survive than the Persian soldiers. So, summary of what I just kind of said: the Greeks surprised the Persians with their resolve to actually fight. They smashed the first wave and entangled the Persian fleet. Another reason is they smashed the front of the Persian fleet and caused them to be kind of jammed up and mixed in. And you can imagine these ships with all these oars sticking out. Once they get smashed together, they're very easy to lose control. They also weren't very terribly sturdy ships. These were not ships that you would cross the Atlantic Ocean in, or in the open ocean. They were meant to sail very close to the coastline, or maybe kind of island hop from island to island. So it was pretty easy to damage them and take them out of commission, and even cause them to sink. The Greeks were much more skilled at sea, and they basically knock out, again, Xerxes' navy at the Battle of Salamis, basically decisively ending the second invasion and ending the Persian Wars in favor of Greece. There's another depiction of the Greek fleet sailing out and smashing Xerxes' fleet into chaos against the shore. Under the tent, it was Xerxes. He reportedly watched the battle from a high point, and then was terrified when he saw his fleet being destroyed, and he decides to flee Greece, hoping to escape with his life. The Greeks, for a time, considered following him and trying to capture him, but they felt that you don't want to trap a beaten man. They knew he was leaving, and they thought if we trap him, he might become more desperate and stay longer and somehow raise a revolt, or raise a resistance. So they do allow Xerxes to escape with his life, but he decides not to invade Greece again. So just another map again that we started with. You have, again, the Ionian revolt that starts it off over in the orange. The first attempt by Darius to punish Athens, but he's defeated on the beaches of Marathon. And then Xerxes' march of vengeance. The path that Xerxes takes is up. If you could look at the key here, and it tells you the route. But Xerxes basically took that pink and green route up across through Thrace and then down through Macedonia. And then you can see he reaches Thermopylae, where there's a little red sword X. So he takes a much longer route versus the cross Aegean Sea route that his father took. All right, big ideas. Thanks for sticking in there. Big ideas. Greek victory in the Persian War saves the ideas that founded Western civilization. Athens, as one of the pillars of Western civilization, with humanism, arete, and rationality or reason, democracy, individual value, freedom, the philosophy we've been talking about, the culture, the language. The New Testament is written in Greek. It's the first lingua franca, the first language that multiple nations and people speak. We'll talk more about that. All of that would not have been able to spread and thrive, or first develop, thrive, and spread, if the Persians, either Darius or Xerxes, had succeeded in snuffing out Athens. Um, Socrates is born after the Persian Wars. And so you don't get Socrates, you don't get Plato, then you don't get Aristotle, you don't get any of this legacy of great classical thinkers. And just trust me, when we even get to Rome, Rome would not be what it is if it wasn't going to be influenced by Greece. And so this battle really was a war that saved Western civilization because it saved Athens and allowed them to grow into kind of a golden age of theater, of political thought, of philosophy. And so it's a really big deal. And again, something like the Battle of Marathon, it's the victory was won against overwhelming odds. So it's almost, not supernatural, but it's a very powerful turning point. It's a story of the underdogs winning and the underdogs then forming what we would call today modern civilization. So it's a big deal. You also had a contrast of the two forces. You had the free men of the Greek city states who had been able to form their own governments, whether oligarchy, democracy, or monarchy, fighting for their homes, fighting for their language and their culture against Darius and Xerxes, who were basically god kings, who were emperors who claimed divine origin, who many of the soldiers in their armed forces were slaves or men who were paid or forced to fight for them. And so it really kind of was a validation of the ability of free men fighting for themselves over tyrants and god kings who rule and enslave others by fear. Not to say just absolutely everything was evil about Persia, but their two world views, just like we looked at the Babylonians and the Jews, their world views were very different. In the Persian culture, there was no real word for freedom. There was no real concept of freedom. If you were a subject of the king, and the king was a servant of God. The idea that you as an individual would have dreams and potential and rights and thoughts, and could speak, against your authorities, that was not something that the Persian culture cultivated. That was something that the Greek culture would come to cultivate more and more. And so again, it's really powerful to see, or to imagine or appreciate what might have been or what might have been lost had these wars, whether it was the sacrifice at Thermopylae, the heroic charge at Marathon, or the naval victory at Salamis, if they had gone the other way. The other thing that we'll touch on later this week is that the victory leads to the rise of the Athenian Empire. They go from being a small city state, kind of an outlier, the crazy democratic city state, to being one of the most powerful city states of Greece, and entering a golden age in which you would have many of their beautiful plays, and many of their greatest philosophical thinkers writing down and developing their ideas. And so, again, that all comes a generation or two after these victories, and therefore would never have happened without them. All righty. Thanks for sticking it out. Hope you got some good notes, and we'll be digging in this tomorrow in class. Take care.